welcome to this week's episode of Backseat Designers, which is, as you'll probably remember, the show where three friends like to sit and bitch about adventure games. Now, of course, I'm my own best friend, and my name is Fred, or Frederick Olsen in full whenever you're signing the warrant, and I'm joined by my good friends, the Space Quest historian himself, Trolls Plymert.
Hello.
That took you quite a while, got the old greys working there, and my other friend, Dr. Gareth Millward.
Hello.
And we're gonna bitch about adventure games, because that's what this show is about. Now, last week, of course, we talked about shit that adventure games need to stop doing, and, well, this week we're going highbrow on your ass. We're gonna talk about games that are based on a true story, or as it were, the concept of basing games on true stories. Because something interesting happened today while we were hypothetically preparing for the episode, which we never do because all of this is improvised. But
of course.
What happened was that we tried thinking of examples of adventure games or story-driven games in general that were based on true stories. And we went to Twitter, and we did get some examples, but that brought to our attention the fact that this is not something that's done very often. And now, Gareth, you've been trying to hide from this, but you're a historian.
Okay, you're throwing me under the bus, yes.
Yes. I know you don't want to admit it, but it's fine. I've been a historian once too, and there is nothing to be ashamed about.
There are focus groups that you can join. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Gareth. I'm a historian. But what I'm trying to say
Gareth.
is,
Hi, Gareth.
you're more than anyone of us, you're famous. You are kind of famous.
Renowned, in fact.
Yeah, renowned for knowing what real life history is all about.
What actually happened in the past.
So,
Actually happened.
yeah. Exactly.
Well, they do say historians are written by the winners. Wait, that doesn't make sense.
Well, that's what his dad tried to tell his mom. But really, Gareth, there are a set of challenges when you try to adapt a real life event into a story with a beginning, a middle, and an end per Aristotle. So, how do you go about doing that? What are some of the challenges as you see them?
I think it's incredibly difficult because I think one of the things that's going to come out of this discussion as well is that there is a difference between adapting a historical story into an adventure game and setting a game in the past. So one of the real challenges, and it's one that academic historians especially find quite a lot, is that I'm not particularly bothered from a professional point of view about those individual small stories that have a good kind of public appeal. I'm more interested in historical processes and the ways in which people lived their everyday lives in the past and the way that things were sort of done on a kind of a more kind of structural level. So finding that that's perfect sweet spot of getting into the archive and finding a really good story that you can do something with is quite difficult. Now, I can come up with examples of what historians have done in the past about picking out a story and doing something interesting with it. Whether they would make good adventure games, I'm not entirely sure, and maybe we can have some discussions there. But it was something that you brought up on Twitter as well, Fred, is that, I mean, I'm a contemporary historian. Most of my work, actually, up to this point, all of my work is post-1939. So there's a good chance that people involved or people who knew the people involved are alive. And if you try to make something dramatic out of their lives, you might come up against some issues from a point of view.
Ethics, indeed.
Yeah,
you have to take survivors into account, and I mentioned Aristotle earlier, and that was not just an example of
not just because you have a fucking boner for the guy.
Yeah,
I mean,
well,
you brought him up more times than we brought up your girlfriend.
That's because that can be discussed. Brought
and
down,
it will be
brought down, as it were. But I have a boner for Aristotle because I read my way through the poetics, and I'm trying to bluff, but really I didn't understand jack shit of it apart from the first sentence. Anyway, the challenge, as I see it, that there also is that real life doesn't really have a beginning and a middle and an end in a dramatical sense. Real life events sometimes end with a whimper rather than a bang, and you don't want a game to go out like that. So there's also that. You have to adapt it to quite a degree. And as Gareth says, there are also ethical implications, especially if you're dealing with stories that are set in times recent enough for there to still be survivors. I mean, it'll probably take about 100 years before you can do a game on the Holocaust without stepping on someone's toes, and even then it'll be sensitive, just to bring out the big elephant in the room, the really big subject.
Well, yeah, but then again, I mean, movies and books surely have dramatized current events. I mean, you've got stuff ranging from the Holocaust to, Erin Brockovich gets her own biopic. Is that how you pronounce it? Biopic or biopic?
That was something I also wanted to bring up, which is that we've talked about player choices and the ramifications of player choices, and you have to be prepared for the fact that the player might make a choice that is not in line with what actually happened, and not in line with the right way to do things, so to speak, the politically correct way.
Well, there is that, but there's also you could take some liberties with history, and that's another area we should probably cover. Is based on a true story does not mean an accurate depiction of what historically happened. It means that you're taking some artistic freedoms with the events that happened. I mean, Schindler's List is not a one-to-one recount of what Schindler was up to.
Actually, run along with that, because that was also a question of mine that I wanted to bring up, because based is a very, very loose term. I mean, something that I thought of earlier today is that technically Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade is based on a true story, because part of it is set in the Third Reich, and that was an actual thing in history. So by that definition, some elements of the game are based on a true story. But really, let's try to define this term based. And you're already on this track, and I nearly derailed you, but get back on track and we'll see what we'll come up with. So how do you define something that's based on a true story, Trolls?
Well, there's been a lot of discussion because, Gareth has an occupation as a historian, and I actually used to have an occupation as a movie reviewer. Granted, I was not a very good one, but I have had the misfortune of having to review certain movies that have been, and these are inverted commas or whatever they are called in America. Actually, what are they called in America? Come on, emphasis time. What are they called?
The Americans say parentheses, the English say inverted commas, so please say inverted commas.
Oh, what? It's not a parentheses. It's the never mind. Shit. Yeah. Lost my train of thought.
Parentheses look nothing like inverted commas.
No, they don't.
I mean, I guess you're looking for inverted commas versus quotation marks, aren't you?
Quotation marks. Jesus,
or as they're sometimes called in Danish, goose eyes.
Shut up! For God's sake, just shut up!
And let's get back on top.
Good point. Yes. I've had the misfortune of reviewing a number of movies that have been, quote-unquote, based on historical events. And when I go and look up what other reviewers have said about this movie or go and look up the actual events, you find out that basically nothing that happened during this, historical time period was actually depicted correctly. I am reminded, of course, of the movie From Hell with Johnny Depp, which is supposed to...
that's awful.
Yeah, which I actually quite liked it, but it was just so far off base of, accepted lore about Jack the Ripper and all this stuff. It was basically a dramatization of what the directors and writers thought that this dude, whose name I forget.
Well, it is a comic book movie. I think the original From Hell comic is actually by Alan Moore, who did V for Vendetta as well. And I don't think he was too terribly concerned with getting the historical events right. I think he just took this setting and he was concerned with making a good story out of it.
Oh, just to briefly cap this off, he was I don't know if he was aware of it, but the writers and directors of the movie certainly were aware of that. The theory that From Hell puts forward about the identity of Jack the Ripper had been discounted very, very, succinctly, like flat out. This is not what.
Yeah, everyone agreed it wasn't Ian Holm.
Yeah, it was not Ian Holm. Ian Holm did not kill everyone. But
he is made of spaghetti and milk.
But it's still sort of based on a true story in that the detective who was hunting for Jack the Ripper was a real life person, and the actual murders in the movie are based on the real crime scene photos that they did, and and such and such. So when you say based on a historical event, you are allowed to take some liberties with the actual events, and putting that into an adventure game context, now we're finally getting to the point. Putting that into an adventure game context, if you want to avoid putting the player in the shoes of a historical person who may or may not have acted in the way that the player wants them to act, you can put a character in that is a complete fabrication who witnesses historical events unfold before him and is by and large powerless to prevent them from, achieving their historical outcome. But you could set a story within that context that does not actually that probably wouldn't have taken place, like something simple, like a love triangle or something, and then have the historical events play out around them. That's one idea.
Yeah, and that seems to happen rarely, because the way to go about this, and I mean, when you mentioned that you'd been a movie reviewer, it brought up the fact in my mind that whenever you sit down and watch a movie that's based on a true story, it always touts it majorly in the credits. I mean, based on a true story. It's as if the font they write that with is bigger than everything else in the opening credits.
And horror film also likes to do this. I'm sorry, Gareth. I'm gonna pull a Kanye West here. Horror films do this, where they say based on a true story. I mean, the Amityville Horror is purported to be based on a true story, although that is completely and utter bullshit. Yeah, sorry, Gareth, you're up.
Yeah, you got me just as I was taking a swig of beer.
You really got me, girl.
Exactly. That makes me think of vinyl. I need to get back to that. But one of the things that you've brought out by bringing up Jack the Ripper, and I'm glad that you did, because I think Natalie on Twitter brought up Jack the Ripper as well and said that God knows how many interpretations of that, is that actually those films aren't based on Jack the Ripper. They're based on the myth and the legend that has surrounded Jack the Ripper.
Yes.
And there are a number of events that have built up their own mythology. You've already brought up the Holocaust. Now, I want to be very careful about how I word this, and want to preface this by saying I'm saying this in terms of academic theory. I am not denying that there was a reality to the Holocaust. I am not denying that a lot of people suffered and died and that it was a truly horrific event. Politically, I think it's one of the worst things that happened in the 20th century, and thankfully we have learnt some lessons from it. However, there are a number of myths and legends that have grown up around the Holocaust on all political sides of this spectrum, from the extreme far-right anti-Semites all the way through to various Jewish communities and people that lived through that time. It is such a horrific event and such a cataclysmic event that it is impossible still, I think. All events are impossible to look at with historical distance. You'll always have some kind of political involvement in them. Mm-hmm. But Jack the Ripper, the Holocaust, other things that you could bring up, anything to do with World War II pretty much has always been framed in these kind of narratives of good versus evil. And it's not to say that those aren't any kind of representation of what any, in inverted commas, in quotation marks, really
Whose eyes?
But we filter these things through narrative and through legend. And films, the Aaron Brockovich film.
I couldn't have done that better myself, really.
Exactly. Yeah.
That was quite a non sequitur.
It's not my first language. that film tells a particular legend about Aaron Brockovich, which probably is based on events. I'm sure if you asked other people that were involved at the time, they would have slightly different feelings on it. But we should never. I don't think if you're going to do something that's entertaining or you're going to do something that's a narrative, I don't think you're ever going to get at what, again, in inverted commas, really happened. However, the one advantage that an adventure game has that other media don't is that we can build a very rich world around it that you can explore to whatever degree you want to explore it in. And you could build that Jack the Ripper narrative, and you could have enough non-playable characters, enough objects that you could interact with to get at some of the things that really interest historians about this particular thing, such as Victorian attitudes towards sex, Victorian attitudes towards prostitution, crime and punishment, the seeming, if you buy one of the theories that it was a member of the royal family that was Jack the Ripper, the ways in which Victorian society was very deferential to those higher up. This is a period in which the police force starts to become a thing. This is very early on in the days of what we now consider the modern police. You can explore those sorts of things by having interactions with police officers or within police stations and things like that.
And
so
I just want I just want to interject briefly that, as far as I know, the notion that it may have been a member of the aristocracy, it may have been a member of the royal family, that was kind of a contemporary theory, wasn't it? So you have this lynch mob of lowly Victorian citizens conspiring that this guy murdering prostitutes may actually be covering something. You know, it may be a member of the aristocracy leading a double life. So there's also something to take into consideration here. You know, another angle entirely. Please go on.
Sorry, but I think what the good doctor was getting at is that it's
you
not
always
necessarily
do that whenever I say something.
Yeah, I do. But
I just wanted to say that was also another angle, along with all the other interesting shit he brought up. I wasn't that much trying to make a point, as if I was saying, well, this is also an angle to...
No. Gareth, please play the I'm wrong sample. But
no, not yet.
No, okay.
We'll hear what you've got to say.
Yeah, but Fred, of course you're right. What I wanted to get at was that it's not necessarily the solving of the Jack the Ripper case that could be interesting. It could be just looking at what happened during that that era.
I agree with you completely, and I think that's what we're getting at here, which is the fact that, and we'll get back to you in a minute, Gareth, promise. but that's the fact
go sit in your corner.
That I think that the error made by a lot of games based on a true story is that they focus on the end goal, and the end goal is already known by us because we know how these historical events played out. Jack the Ripper was never caught. Well, that's not the interesting part of the story. The interesting part is the journey there. And I think the error made, apart from not focusing on all the angles of spectators as Gareth is talking about,
as opposed to the elbows and the eyes.
Exactly. Well, the error is that the end game is really made the most important thing, whereas, as I mentioned earlier, usually these historical events end with a whimper rather than a bang. So that's not the interesting bit. The interesting bit is how the fuck did we get there? Now, over to you again, Gareth. Sorry.
Well, no, I'm glad you interrupted my Millie monologue, because I think I was starting to...
Or as it were, the Millard monologue?
The Millard monologue, yeah. I was getting towards ramble territory there. But yeah, but you said the really interesting bit about it is these things, and maybe they're the most interesting things to me, or even to you. But then there's another imperative with the entertainment industry, and that is to provide something that has mass appeal. And actually, the kind of historical stories that you see have mass appeal. You've only got to turn the History Channel on to understand this. It's Nazis, it's Egyptians, it's the royal families of Europe, it's wars, and it's the sort of the kind of stuff that appears, or at least the History Channel thinks has mass appeal. Are those more cut and dried narratives of good versus evil, us versus them,
Well,
that kind of history.
I love where you're going with that.
I would actually posit that the entertainment industry is way better off these days. I mean, these days we favor dark and gritty. I mean, look at shit like Christopher Nolan's Batman movies. We want Batman to bleed. We want him to be one of us. So I posit that these days your odds of telling a story about an everyman who finds him or herself at the center of a real historical event is way better than it was in the 80s or 90s.
Okay. So spunky. And I love spunk.
That was a new one. Okay,
new one.
Let's pull this one back a bit and focus
See,
on
he does it every time I say something. Let's pull this back a bit. I believe what the good doctor was saying
No,
was...
but I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm just saying
right,
and I was wrong.
Yes, you are.
And there it was. There it was. No, I just wanted to get, because if you're going to build a narrative based around a historical event, then you got to look at, well, what makes a narrative interesting? At least in the sense of adventure games, usually they're about uncovering a mystery. It's not like a biopic where you just want to know what happened in this person's life. I mean, I was watching the Johnny Cash movie Walk the Line, which is a fantastic movie.
I love it.
It's just this guy going through his life, and there's no real mystery to it. It's just it's a character study more than anything, and I don't believe there's been any adventure games out there where the focus has been on a character story instead of uncovering the mystery. And I think that would be an interesting way to deal with it.
It would. Well, I'm not advocating that we do biopic adventure movies. Certainly, I'm just saying that.
Actually, I can think.
Well, if I may get philosophical for a moment, most of our lives are, in essence, quests. I mean, we try to get from one goal to another, and having one person's quest against a historical backdrop could make a good game. I mean, you would have to dramatically make it so that it's not just this person's quest to go buy milk or some shit. You would have to have some more interesting events than that. But it could be done. In fact, it would be kind of interesting to kind of start out with this drone existence, and then shit happens. I don't know, World War I happens, World War II happens, Cuban Missile Crisis happens, something. JFK gets assassinated. Any one of these big events, and then your life as the player character is kind of juxtaposed against that. It could be interesting, and no games, as far as I know, do that.
Well, there's also the chance of not setting it against a particularly cataclysmic event, but just setting it in a historical setting where maybe you're not playing as a known historical character, but you encounter historical characters along the way.
I remember you brought up such an example, Gareth, if I may. Sorry.
Oh, yeah, please.
Hashtag sorry, not sorry, trolls. But Gareth, you once mentioned this, and I believe you mentioned this on the show before, way back when in Season 2, when we were actually hanging out at my apartment. You mentioned that you were interested in perhaps doing an adventure game based around the everyday life of a Pakistani family who immigrated to England in the 1970s, around the whole Powell era.
Yeah, that's a possibility. I mean, there was a particular event where smallpox got imported into Britain by a few people who came. There was a smallpox outbreak in Karachi in Pakistan. And a few Pakistani people came across to Britain, some via Paris, to avoid the sort of the health checks that had been put in place, and they'd had fake vaccination certificates, so they hadn't actually been vaccinated against smallpox, and certainly hadn't been revaccinated against smallpox in the near, talking about something that happened just before something in the past. I'm not sure the grammatical construction there.
The near past.
Yes, in the recentness.
It's not his first language.
It's not my first language, people.
He's just making up non sequiturs.
As we all know, English was invented in Charleston, Virginia, and no. Yeah, so they came across and did their thing, and they spread smallpox to about a dozen people in Britain in the early 1960s. And as a result, there was a lot of anti-Pakistani sentiment in the sort of the environment. So I mean, you could set a Pakistani family within that kind of period, because they're not to blame at all. They're not even passively to blame for bringing smallpox in just as an accident. That they have absolutely nothing to do with this, but they're being blamed for the actions of other people. I mean, can you imagine the actions of other people being used to?
Well, it was certainly something that filled up a huge space in at that time. One thing I do know of, random trivia, is that the Beatles did their final album, Let It Be, around that time, and one alternate take of the song Get Back actually has him making up satirical lyrics on the spot about Enoch Powell and his attitudes towards, as they were called, unfortunately, to the shame of many of you, I imagine, the Packies. So you have this song about the woman from Tucson, Arizona, being made into an anti-immigration song, a complete satire. So it was something that filled up the minds of many at that point. Yeah.
Mm. I mean, you could put it into that kind of setting. At that point, you're maybe veering away from basing it on a true story and creating a period piece and period events. I mean, the historical inaccuracies in it are legion, but you could take something like Downton Abbey, which, I mean, it is not really based on a true story, but is sort of set in that kind of era with the kind of whatever Julian Fellows thinks was going on at that time. A better example actually would be, and I say this as a historian of medicine, so I should hate it, but if you've ever seen the show The Nick, which is set in a New York hospital at the turn of the around 1900.
He's very good at this.
My first language.
Turn of the other century.
I hope this is not how you give lectures.
It's not that far off. That's the annoying thing. That does it a bit better. And actually, there's probably elements of that. There's probably episodes actually of that show that you could maybe adventurize, where it's sort of set in this period where they're just discovering bacteria, the X-ray, and then there's all these other kind of social things going on as well, which are really interesting, about immigration, about epidemic controls, about the ways in which hospitals were funded at that time through voluntary donations and through private benefactors. There's all sorts of things that you could explore within that historical setting.
Well, this leads to another question that I want to pose to you guys. Because now we've been around a bit, I feel, and we've covered how you would go about a game that is based on a true story, as in one-on-one. You've got everything dried out, cut for you. And we've been around the other end of the spectrum, where you have a game that takes dramatic licenses but pits, kind of a spectator NPC in the middle of historical events, and then maybe it takes fictional steps to fit that NPC into the historical narrative. But what I want to ask you guys is, which of those two extremes, so to speak, do you find more appealing?
Surely depends.
Well,
on tell.
Yeah, I would say that I think Gareth brought up a very good point about based on a true story is not the same as based in a historical setting. I mean, if you look at if you look at Francisco Gonzalez's A Golden Wake, he based that in a time period, but it's not based on a true story, in the sense that the as far as I know, the main character is based on a real person, but I actually don't know. I haven't actually played it.
That's what I've read as well, and it's based in the 1930s, is it? And I believe the player character is meant to be real. What I wanted to add to what you said is that until I give you guys full reign. What I want to say is that in my mind, it kind of depends on how important to the overall narrative the historical event is.
But I can think of a historical event that would involve a small cast of characters, that involves logic puzzles, that would appeal to a broad audience because it has, explosions and science and all this other kind of stuff.
Does it have tits?
No.
Well,
No,
we can
no,
work.
it
We can
probably
probably work those in.
We can probably work those in somehow. The Apollo 13 crisis.
Ooh. Well, do explain, sir, because I'm getting my Apollos mixed up here.
The Apollo 13 went absolutely to shit.
Oh, that's the one with Tom Hanks, isn't it?
Yeah.
Tom Hanks was not aboard Apollo 13. No.
Oh, that's right.
Tom Hanks did not crash Apollo 13.
Because he was busy being a teenager in a grown man's body.
I like that film.
Which one of them?
Complete silence. Whatever you ask me to do, I'm not editing that out.
Apollo 13 was, for those of you who don't know and haven't seen the Ron Howard film, Tom Hanks, played by Jim Lovell, was the commander of... was the commander of a module.
Ed Harris was in mission control.
Basically, they tried to get to the moon and they missed because there were problems on board, and they basically had to spend most of their time coming home trying to fix everything that was going wrong inside their pod, just so that they could get around the moon and get back to Earth in one piece.
They actually did a slingshot maneuver, didn't they? Which is
did not go back in time.
I kind of thought that to be a Star Trek the original series kind of thing, and that's ludicrous. No one would ever do that, but they actually did. They actually used gravity for propulsion.
Yeah, well, the Apollo missions used a free return trajectory orbit, so it was always planned that the way that they would come back would bring them back towards Earth. But they did, at a particular point in the moon's orbit, I think they had to make a burn to make sure that they had the right trajectory coming off the moon, using the gravity to pull them back in. If you've ever played Kerbal Space Program, not an adventure game, but I'm going to plug that because it's a great game. And
Hashtag not an adventure game.
Hashtag not an adventure game, but it's very good, and it will teach you orbital mechanics. Anyway, all the way through that, they have to do things like they need to rebuild their oxygen filter. They need to make sure that they make the right adjustments at the right time. And this is a perfect game where there are clear consequences to your actions. You fuck up, you die.
Yeah, and literally, lots of the puzzles are literally fitting a square peg into a round hole.
Exactly. And you wouldn't necessarily have to do them exactly the same as they happen in real life. You could take liberties with that. You'd certainly have to take liberties with the pacing, because obviously it took them a few days to get from being up shit creek to getting back. There would have been periods where they weren't doing anything. They were just sitting there freezing their bollocks off. And you could...
That's a scientific term, folks.
It's a scientific term as well, yeah. So there's all sorts of things that you could do with that. It's based on a real event. It's obviously already been made into a film. And yeah, you kind of know that if you do everything right, you're going to survive. But you might not necessarily do everything right. So there's plenty of options for dying. There's plenty of options for you to, and I know trolls would love this, you'd have infinite saves. So that you could.
Oh, now you're just bringing in hand jobs by the dozen.
And there's obviously an opportunity for.
But that place will literally kill you.
So I mean,
and you've got multiple characters, because there were 3 of them, and I guess what you're saying about there being consequences to choices that we know to be incorrect would be that, as we know the true story, all of them made it back, which is quite impressive. But there was certainly enough room for one of them dying.
Yeah, you could do something like that. You could certainly therefore, if you just want to play through it, solving all the puzzles and get back to Earth, fine, play through it in 4 or 5 hours and win the game and move on. But if you don't, you've got the opportunity to have conversations with those characters and learn more about the mission, learn more about Apollo, learn more about their real lives. You could even have scenes that were based in Mission Control, where in Mission Control they need to work out how to solve it.
You could have some very, very interesting mechanics here, because I'm reminded by the comic by Hergé, the Tintin comic, where they go to the moon, where one of the characters sacrifices himself because there won't be enough oxygen for all of them to make it back. And just to have a setting where that option becomes feasible, I think would be very interesting. You know, what do you do as a player? Do you sacrifice one of the player characters knowing that you may not all get back if you keep him alive? You know, I think there is an urgency to this story which is not seen usually in adventure games, which I think is a fucking shame, to be honest.
Yeah, and I think it could work like as a really good game, and I don't think that any of the actual people involved in it, now either currently living or possibly dead, would object to. It would basically turn into an adventure simulator kind of thing, where this is what could also have happened. It didn't, and we're perfectly fine with it. But
this is a very good example, and I'm loving it. For everyone listening, this is now our intellectual property.
And actually, Gareth, when you started out your preamble for this, I thought dead sure you were going to bring up the Manhattan Project, which also has. And forgive me, I don't know enough about the Manhattan Project to actually know.
Can we bring up something else something else other than the Manhattan Project, because it always leaves me terribly bored.
Oh no!
Well, you brought up Tintin in this week of all weeks.
You guys didn't get the pun at all.
I'm sorry, but you could. Yeah, I know exactly. That. Yeah,
bored.
Exactly.
Bored.
But
Niels Bohr was part
I
of
get
the
it.
Project.
Shut up! For God's sake, just shut up!
Well, Gareth got it. Over to you, trolls.
Right. You have a cast of characters, and they are all tasked with doing something that I'm pretty sure at least a handful of them were kind of not quite comfortable with. So you have an end goal, which is to build an atomic device that's going to kill everything, and then you can have interpersonal struggles. And I'm not sure that actual historical records of the day-to-day life of the people involved with the Manhattan Project exist. So you could take some artistic liberties with these people. Most of them are also dead. So that kind of works in your favor.
Well, they were probably, they were living at one military base. So I guess off work, it was kind of like a sitcom. I guess it was Friends off work.
You could.
That would be an amazing
sitcom setting. Well, yeah, but we do have interviews with Oppenheimer and Einstein and Bohr and people like that. We have some kind of inkling as to what went on. We have memoirs. There'll certainly be records that were kept by civil servants and people at the time. So I mean, there's what's good about what you've said there, Trolls, is that you've got the scope to base it on real life, but also because there's so much we don't know, you're almost given a green light to take that artistic license to build the perfect sitcom.
You can even do unreliable narrator stuff, like switch the perspective and have different events play out differently according to which character you're now controlling, witnessing the event. So you got like maybe an episodic thing where the end game is pretty much always the same, but playing it through with different characters. Some characters might change their personas entirely because this one person really didn't like this other person, and then you switch viewpoints, and then all of a sudden this person is a very, very kind person, something like that.
And I have the perfect theme song for the game, you guys. It's the end of the world, and I know it, and I feel fine. The Manhattan Project is taped before a live studio audience.
Okay, can I bring up an actual real life example of an adventure game based on a true story?
No.
Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
And this is the only example that I can think of which I've actually played. It's not a historical account by any stretch of the imagination, but it is Take-Two's Black Dahlia, which takes enough elements from real-world events to the point where I would say it is based on, well, several true stories, in fact. And it takes an incredible amount of artistic liberty with it because it goes all, paranormal investigator on your ass at some point. It starts out with you being an investigator trying to catch the torso killer. And it turns out that the torso killer is apparently a shaman from hell, and there's a portal somewhere off in the. But it takes.
And this all happened.
But it does it. It takes place over a great stretch of years. I think 10 years pass from start to finish in the game, and like I say, it takes inspiration from a number of historical events, not just the torso killer, but the Second World War breaks out in the middle of everything. You've got these American agencies that were popping up to identify certain Nazi sympathizers in the U.S. And all this incredible ghost, and even the Black Dahlia herself, which is a murder mystery that was never really solved, as far as I know. She was an actress who suddenly wound up in a ditch somewhere. Hi, Squares. Nice to hear from you. And she's kind of a bit player in the game, and there's no real reason why the game is actually named Black Dahlia, because she shows up once and is never mentioned again. But I would really urge people who are interested in American history to play that game. Not that it, again, is a faithful retelling of historical events, but enough research has gone into this game to make it very, very interesting, for people interested in history.
So it sounds kind of like an example of what Gareth was bringing up earlier, dramatization based upon a real-life event, or several, as it were.
Yes, and it has, it has a mystery. You're trying to find the torso killer, who, again, as far as I know, please don't hold me to this, was never actually caught, or they didn't find the right person. And, Elliot Ness shows up in the middle of everything and goes, I found him.
How do you kill a torso?
No, he hacked people to bits.
Oh.
That's
lovely.
Yeah. Oh, and should we bring up Richard Bobbitt's example?
Yeah,
yes,
please do.
I
haven't actually played it. Have any of you guys?
I don't think anyone has. I mean, Richard must be the only one in the world.
Well, Richard has. Poor guy. I mean, that's the disadvantage of doing something like the Crapshoot series, which is something Richard does. And incidentally, to anyone listening, you should check him out over on YouTube. He's pretty brilliant.
Rasp, rasp, rasp. You're losing it, Sam.
Anyway, we did ask this out on Twitter. Did anyone have examples of games that were based on historical events? And DOS Nostalgic brought up JFK Reloaded, which is
the sequel to which is the sequel to Zapruder Rewound.
Oh dear God, that was tasteless. And so was the game, incidentally. Not an adventure game. Anyway, Richard, however, chimed in with a game called The Unicorn Killer, which is apparently about a real-life murderer who hacked
I fucking hate that brony shit.
He evaded justice for 25 years after beating his ex-girlfriend to death and stashing her corpse in a closet. And you play as the detectives who are trying to find him. Although it's a really terrible game because it's a hidden object game where you do no investigating of any sort. You just pick through random shit. But it is
specifically a pine cone, as far as I understand.
People, we should put this in the blog post. What the other shows refer to as the show notes. This is Richard wrote about this on PC Gamer. It's a hilarious dramatization of a game that is a dramatization.
Well, everything that guy writes is hilarious, but especially if it involves pine cones.
Yeah, the pine cone is the rapist. No.
Well, that's interesting. You should say that. No, do carry on.
No, that is pretty much it. Games exist, but not enough games take the time to investigate real-life events to actually build a cohesive narrative around them. Francisco did, and the guys who did Black Dahlia did.
I get enough of your games, Babushka Mailbox.
Well, what I'm kind of gathering from the conversation that we've had, if I may try to wrap it up, I'm interrupting you, and I do so knowingly. What I'm taking away from this is that
I was done.
is that adventure game developers could benefit a lot from hiring people like, well, our friend Gareth here.
No.
I'm creating career opportunities for you here.
No,
man.
but I'm being serious in when I'm saying no, because I'm not the kind of historian that does the kind of history that that you're going to find good narratives.
Well, okay, then don't hire Gareth. My point actually was kind of that if you do a game that's rooted in an actual story, what you do want to is to get inside the head of whomever is living through these events as a spectator or as a prime player or as a secondary player. And as far as I've understood in this conversation, you kind of work with that. You know, you look at what was the public opinion at the time. If you had a member of the public who was a spectator to this event, how would she or he react to it? And I just think that adventure game developers should look into that. You know, don't be a Wikipedia researcher and think for a second that you can take a real life historical event and make an interesting game based on it, based on that. But try to work your way into those events and kind of weave around the threads a bit. You know, don't just go with the flow. Go around it. You know.
I completely agree with that. I mean, if you do want to get good ideas from people who can do good stuff with you, I'll do my professional. Well, yes, exactly.
Notice how it changed his opinion. The rent is due.
No, I'm not going to suggest me. Actually, there was a movement in history in the late '80s called microhistory, and I mentioned this when I got drunk in Fred's apartment, talking about.
I strangely don't remember.
Oh, talking about Natalie Zeman Davis's The Return of Martin Guerre.
Je suis Martin Guerre.
Je suis Martin Guerre. There was Ginsberg's The Cheese and the Worms, about a guy who genuinely believed that the universe was a wheel of cheese and we were just worms working our way through it.
Nice.
Microhistory is really good because it does deliberately take those individual narratives and tries to extrapolate what we can learn about those societies from these individual sort of curiosities. There's also people's memoirs and people's oral histories. If you are interested in actually doing anything with this, go to the Oral History Society's webpage and ask around there if they've got any good stories, because it's not just that you'll be able to get the historical setting in which this world in which you can immerse the players and everything into the game. You'll also get some really interesting individual stories. It may not be that one of those stories makes the main narrative of the game, but each of those individual mini-stories might help to flesh out the biographies of your non-playable characters, or even the character that the ego character for the game. So those versions of history and those versions of academic history, I think, could be really useful, and I would really encourage people to look at microhistorians and oral historians and delve into that. I'm just saying that Dr. Gareth Millward, is not probably going to help you very much in terms of the individual stories, but I'm more than happy to give you advice about how you can make the background more rich and appealing.
So what I'm gathering from you guys is that no, I'm hosting. You wait. I'm gathering. What I'm gathering, and you better hope I don't fucking bring out Virginia Capers. What I'm gathering from you guys what I'm gathering from you guys is that most so-called historical games are kind of superficial, whereas what you seem to advocate, Gareth, is really digging in there. Now,
that's what I'd want. Yeah.
What did you want to say, Trolls?
I was just going to say
You're
briefly,
absolutely right, and I was wrong.
Thank you. And on that bombshell, it's time to... No, please do go on.
It's just a quick wrap up. It is that we've sort of been dancing around the issue that we should not make the main playable character a historical figure, because God knows the surviving family members
the ramifications are just too huge. I mean, no one wants to
Shut
play
up!
as...
For God's sake, just shut up!
No one wants to play as Hitler. No one wants to play as JFK. I mean, not only are the ramifications too big, but it's just...
Wait. that's not what I was getting at all. What I was getting at is if you
see, you know how now you know how now you know how it feels.
Shut up, for God's sake, just shut up.
Maybe I should just save this wrap-up spiel for the After Dark.
I blew up the historian. No, please try. I'll try to shut up. I'll try to. Right. I tried to shut up for you, Trot.
What I was getting at is you could go to archives and dig up, like Gareth says, oral histories, diaries of people who are quote-unquote unimportant in the grand scheme of things, but just look at their memories of historical events and build a narrative around that. I mean, the person who wrote these memoirs has a how the hell did I pronounce that? Certainly has a view on the situation around them, and if you just go by their accounts, flawed and subjective though it may be, it could still be an interesting story. And I'm pretty sure the surviving family members would not be as if they even exist,
any,
would not
so,
be.
You know, but go a few centuries back and it won't be an issue. So
yeah. So that was really it. You shouldn't be afraid to make your main playable character a historical figure. Just, make sure it's not a historical figure that people would get their panties in a twist on because they had this idea that he was this glorious person or he was this fucking asshole or whatever category you want to put JFK in. He was a great leader. No, he was a womanizer. He was a
yeah, and you don't want to go into there's a quote from, I think it's Bill Bailey, who did a song where he says even top blokes turn to it's the other way around. Even bastards turn to top blokes when they're dead. History, written history is kind of skewed in the favor of those who won. I mean, history is always written by the winners.
It's written by the winners.
Exactly. Yeah. And JFK was probably a womanizing bastard, but we know him as this great president because he was assassinated.
No, hold on. No, but this is the kind of point that historians would make. He was both. That's the point.
Yes.
It depends on the legend and the narrative that you want to build around him. And actually, if you want to go down that route, maybe you could have an adventure game where you can choose at the beginning who you're going to be as the playable character. And depending on your playthrough and depending on the choices you make, in some ways, you're close to JFK for some reason. Playing through as one character, he comes across as this great statesman that sent us to the moon and helped the Civil Rights Bill, which he was. Or in one playthrough, he's this womanizing drug addict, which he probably was. You go through another version, and he's very much a product of his Catholic upbringing in a very unique family, probably suffering from lupus as well, and with all these other kind of problems, which again is probably true. Well, there are all sorts of narratives you can tell about JFK, and none of them is wrong, and none of them is right.
Well, that was my point exactly as to why adventure game developers should turn to people like you or the denizens of oral history. Because if you just go to Wikipedia, then what you're going to walk away with would largely be the mainstream narrative, which is Kennedy the statesman, which is not very interesting. But what you've got
what you don't want is someone to go, that person did not do their homework.
Exactly.
You really have to be careful with this.
Exactly. What you've got here is a great multi-faceted character study, which to my knowledge is something that's missing from adventure games. We talked about Gabriel Knight last week, and there is a protagonist who's multifaceted in that he's a womanizing asshole on one side, and on the other side he's a Schattenjäger defeating all things occult, and he's very, very noble. And taking that multifaceted approach, Tex Murphy being another candidate, and applying to real historical figures. I mean, we all have these sides. We all have light sides. We all have dark sides. Getting that in there would be really interesting.
I think we should wrap this up now. I think we've done good. I think we've done good.
We're absolutely done. And if you liked what you listened to, I think it was a good episode, so I can, kind of agree with you, but mostly I'll blame you. What the hell is wrong with you? But if you liked what you listened to, head on over to backseatdesigners.com, where you can find all the links to past seasons we've done. You can find the schedule. You can find the subscribe links. You can even find our Patreon account. I can also give you a direct link, patreon.com/backseatdesigners, where you can give us money, or as it's called my secret code, Coke Fund. Sorry, guys, trying to quit. We also have a spin-off show called Open Crowdsource, which you may find interesting. If you want to interact with us to any degree, hit us up over on Twitter. We're at BS Designers. We have an open Facebook group as well called Backseat Designers, where you can shout at us, bring up suggestions. We're a very impressionable individuals, so I'm sure we'll consider pretty much everything you fling at us. So do accept our invitation to that. Say goodbye, trolls.
Goodbye.
And say goodbye, Gareth.
Skelly.
And it's a big wholehearted Skelly from me as well. And may God bless us, everyone, and happy Easter to Jippus Cribbus on the cross. See you next week.
No more for today.
I may have been too inebriated to do this.